Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 38. This time we explore Conan Doyle's lifelong fascination with true crime through strange studies from life, his dramatic retellings of 3 murder cases which appeared in the Strand in spring 1901. And here's Paul to introduce the stories.
In early 1901, Arthur Conan Doyle embarked upon a proposed series of 12 factual studies of true-life crime cases for the Strand magazine. In the end, he only completed 3. The Holocaust of Manor Place, the love affair of George Vincent Parker, and the debatable case of Mrs. Emsley, which appeared in the issues for March, April and May. All concerned sensational murder cases from the 1860s, and all raised uncomfortable questions about the validity of capital punishment.
The strange studies from life were written over the winter of 1900-1901, just as Conan Doyle was becoming more of a public figure, really. His writing had given him a platform in the 1890s, and he'd always been outspoken. But on his return from the Boer War in July 1900, he seems to have stepped up his presence as a public figure. He gave evidence before the South Africa Hospital Commission to argue for military reform. And then in September, he decided to stand for the Liberal Unionists and contested the seat of Edinburgh Central in the 1900 election, the Khaki election as it was known. And as Paul said, around this time he pitched a true crime series to the Strand. It may well have been that his mind was turning to public policy issues. And those first 3 parts, Manor Place, George Vincent Parker, and the case of Mrs. Emsley, were printed in the March, April, and May issues of the Strand in 1901. But from the first, Conan Doyle seems to have been distinctly uncomfortable about the project. And he wrote to Greenhouse Smith saying, "I don't think I ever felt more uncertain about anything. However, since they've gone out to be illustrated, let it stand, but I will write no more until we see how these seem to go." As for the public reaction, Andrew Lycett notes that Conan Doyle called a halt to the series after receiving letters of complaint from the families of those involved. But there might also be the case that Conan Doyle had just become generally disenchanted with the whole theme. There's a one line at the end of the second of those stories where Conan Doyle describes the crime as being characterized by all that inconsequence and grim artlessness which distinguishes fact from fiction. As it happened, though, he had the perfect get-out, because at the end of April 1901, just as the third of the strange studies was appearing in the Strand, he took a short break at Cromer in Norfolk with a new friend, Bertram Fletcher Robinson, who was a correspondent for the Daily Express, who he'd met on the return journey from South Africa in July 1900. And it was there that Robinson sowed the seed of an idea for a story about a monstrous demon hound that they agreed to write together. Conan Doyle wrote excitedly to his mother about this new creeper, which he was going to call the Hound of the Baskervilles, and he very quickly pitched the idea to Greenhouse Smith. And though it was a standalone Gothic story at the time, a few weeks later it would become a Sherlock Holmes story. Fletcher Robinson's name disappeared into the background, and the rest of it is history. And presumably the Strand were more than eager to release Conan Doyle from his obligations to write strange studies, given the opportunity to have a new Sherlock Holmes story. The 3 strange studies from life were originally collected in 1963 by the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Literary Society, a short-lived group that had intended to produce an annual publication, but in the end only produced this single volume. And it was later reprinted with other true crime narratives by Jack Tracy in 1988.
Yes, it's really fascinating what you say there about the Hand of the Baskervilles, Mark, because you've got to wonder if this is why these three pieces have virtually disappeared.
Mm.
Doyle wanted them forgotten, essentially. And then you've got the Hound comes along, this real blockbuster.
Mm.
And even today, the strange studies from life just aren't well known by Holmes or Doyle aficionados.
Yes, yeah,
Mm.
indeed. The other thing that's not that well known is really the extent of Conan Doyle's interest in true crime. I mean, obviously he's known for his involvement in the Edulge case and the case of Oscar Slater, but he actually had a lifelong interest in true crime, really from childhood. His father had illustrated criminal trials in Edinburgh for the Illustrated Times, and the Doyle family friend John Hill Burton wrote, I think it's a 2-volume work, Narratives from Criminal Trials in Scotland in the 1850s. And there was actually quite an extensive study of Conan Doyle's relationship with true crime by Peter Costello in The Real World of Sherlock Holmes in 1991. And he noted that these influences plus others in Edinburgh might have contributed to this early fascination. One of the really interesting things he brings out there is the fact that Edinburgh was a centre of very early crime writing. James McGovern, who wrote a series of works with titles like Brought to Bay or Experiences of a City Detective or Traced and Tracked or Memoirs of a City Detective, which actually sold in very great numbers. They went to the 11th, 12th, 13th editions. I always think it's quite interesting that those stories have those titles, experiences of, records of, recollections of, memoirs of.
Mm.
There might well be something else that Conan Doyle remembered. But also as a child, he had a taste for the bloodthirsty.
Mm.
In 1872, at the tender age of 13, he saw the play The Courier of Leon, which was based on the novel by Charles Reade, which in itself was based on a criminal trial from 1796 about a particularly gruesome stagecoach robbery in which the driver and the guard were brutally killed. And Conan Doyle, on seeing this play in 1872, wrote to his mother and said it was a jolly play and put in brackets 5 murders. But 2 years after seeing that play, he went to London to stay with his aunt and uncle. This was late 1874, and it was at that time that he visited the famous Madame Tussauds and the Chamber of Horrors. And Costello points out that actually there were 3 displays there that are directly relevant to this topic. One of them was the mutiny aboard the Flowery Land. One of them was the William Youngman case, which became the Holocaust of Manor place. And the third was Mrs. Emsley. And in fact, the museum had a recreation of the room in which Mrs. Emsley was found. And it obviously stayed with him because in December 1903, he spoke at the centenary dinner for Madame Tussauds and recounted the thrill of entering the sacred halls of the Chamber of Horrors. It's always struck me that the timing of that is quite interesting in that only a few months earlier, Conan Doyle had written The Empty House, in which, of course, the waxwork bust of Sherlock Holmes is the MacGuffin, and he must have been booked for the dinner by then. But he also had this interest from childhood in the macabre, and that's probably seen as much in his fascination with the works of Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah, and Poe is particularly pertinent to bring in at this juncture. Really thinking of the mystery of Marie Roget,
Mm,
in which Poe reset the actual death of Mary Rogers, the cigar girl in New
mm,
York. He simply gave her name a French flavour
mm.
and moved the setting of the crime to Paris, and set Dupin on the case. But unfortunately, Poe then did one of his usual things and got a bit carried away with his own cleverness and turned what was a promising story essentially into an essay.
Yes, yeah.
And this is the danger of this whole crime writers wandering into the true crime genre, as we will certainly see as we investigate these strange studies from life more closely.
Yeah. And another writer who we've mentioned on the podcast before who comes in at this point, I think, is Alexander Dumas as well, who wrote this 8-volume Celebrated Crimes, which was written between about 1839 and 1841. It wasn't just Dumas' work, but it was with the assistance of several collaborators. And it was really a series of around about 20 articles, which were sort of retelling the real life events. I mean, probably the most notable story in there is the case of Lucretia Borgia. We know that this was in Conan Doyle's possession because Margaret Fox in Conan Doyle for the Defense, which was a book that came out about Conan Doyle and the Oscar Slater case, notes that Conan Doyle amassed a library of non-fiction true crime books and clippings, which included Dumas' 8-volume edition of Celebrated Crimes. And in fact, throughout his life, he collected true crime volumes. In 1911, he purchased 51 true crime volumes from the estate of W.S. Gilbert of Gilbert and Sullivan fame. And the Harry Ransom Center in the US actually has Conan Doyle's copy of Gilbert's copy of the Newgate calendar, which, of course, was a very influential text in that it sort of inspired a number of 19th century crime writers. And there was some criticism, indeed, at the time of the, quotes, Newgate school of writing. Thackeray regarded Oliver Twist as being an example of it. And in fact, Dickens does reference the Newgate calendar twice in Oliver Twist as well. So he definitely had a lifelong interest in true crime.
It's notable that he doesn't particularly mention this in Through the Magic Door.
No, he
It's
doesn't.
not something he boasts about. He talks with real love and affection of his Napoleonic memoirs or his books on boxing.
Mm.
But the true crime collection and his taste for true crime literature is very much sidelined.
Yes, I think there's a sense in which, even in his handling of the 3 cases discussed here, that he sees that there's something disreputable in the whole business. So let's take a look at these 3 stories in a bit more detail. So, Paul, what was the Holocaust of Manor Place about?
This story is based on a case from 1860. And the 2 central characters are a 25-year-old man called William Godfrey Youngman, who's a tailor, son of a tailor as well. And he became engaged to a farmer's daughter called Mary Streeter. And on 28th of July 1860, Youngman invited Mary to stay with his family in London. But before coming, he enjoined her to burn their correspondence, which she didn't. And he also had previously persuaded her to insure her life for £100.
Yes.
She arrived in London on 30th of July to stay at 16 Manor Place with Youngman, his parents, and his 2 young brothers. The couple visited the Green Dragon in Bermondsey, which was owned by Edward Spicer, who was actually a family friend of the Streeters.
Mm.
And he just didn't like Youngman on instinct and warned Mary off. And then later on, they went to see a play starring the great tragedian William Macready.
Yes.
And then at about 5:30 a.m. on the next morning, Mrs. Beard, who was another lodger in Manor Place, was awoken by a cry and a thud. Her husband and a man called Bevan, who was actually the landlord, went to see what was going on, and they were confronted by a blood-soaked Youngman, claiming that his mother had killed Mary and the 2 Youngman brothers, and that he, William, had killed his mother in self-defence. A doctor and a policeman were fetched, and Youngman was, unsurprisingly, arrested and sent for trial. The jury were unconvinced by his story about his mother going mad and murdering the rest of the family. And he was hanged on the 4th of September before a crowd of some 30,000 spectators.
Yeah.
After studying this story, Conan Doyle's conclusion was that Youngman was probably guilty, but insane, and should really have been placed in an asylum rather than hanged.
Yes. And this sort of tees up something that is a bit of a running theme here in the 3 stories, which is Conan Doyle's willingness to accept alternative interpretations of events, no matter how ludicrous those alternative explanations may be.
Yes, you have to look at the facts that Youngman had insured his sweetheart's her life for £100, and that he'd enjoined her to burn letters and correspondence. That kind of does suggest a certain amount of malice aforethought.
One of the things that struck me about this one was that for all this is an incredibly brutal and bloody crime, actually Conan Doyle doesn't go into a huge amount of detail. The horrors are really sort of off camera, And at one point, Conan Doyle says, the motives and mind of the murderer are of perennial interest to every student of human nature, but the vile record of his actual brutality may be allowed to pass away when the ends of justice have once been served by their recital. And he kind of sweeps it away a bit like, I just wondered if he was trying to appease Strand readers' tastes, or maybe he felt that this sort of prurient interest was beneath them.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know what Greenhouse Smith, the editor of the Strand, what role he might have played in this, and if he'd suggested toning them down, or because the Strand, although it had plenty of crime fiction in it, it was still aimed at a very sort of middle class market. And there's a degree of a family market to it as well. I mean, you just look at some of the other articles you'll find in it. You know, here's 3 pages of photographs of funny shaped potatoes, that sort of thing, to amuse the children.
Yes.
So there's a lot of that going on. Or it tried to present itself as a higher class of magazine.
Yeah.
Again, there is very much, I think, this sense of a middle class Victorian Edwardian family audience that thus far no further.
The other thing that you see in The Holocaust of Man of Place is that Conan Doyle is trying to do a kind of study of criminal psychology. And in this case, his big point is a somewhat peculiar one. He talks a lot about the selfishness of young men. He says, in the study of criminal psychology, one is forced to the conclusion that the most dangerous of all types of mind is that of the inordinately selfish man. He is a man who has lost his sense of proportion. His own will and his own interest have blotted out for him the duty which he owes to the community. Selfishness is no harmless peccadillo, but is an evil root from which the most monstrous growths may spring. But to sort of present selfishness as a kind of form of insanity to some extent, which is kind of where he ends up at the end of this, just doesn't really make sense. There's an interesting aside he makes, though, where he draws a comparison from the character of William Youngman to the character of Sir Willoughby Patton from George Meredith's The Egoist from 1879, which was a kind of breakthrough novel for Meredith. Conan Doyle wrote, Patron was the eternal type of all egoists, may be an amusing and harmless character as long as things go well with him, but let him be thwarted, let the thing which he desires be withheld from him, and the most monstrous results may follow.
Yeah, and this is also obviously frequently echoed throughout the Sherlockian canon. I mean, you have to think straight of a character like Dr. Grimsby Roylott, who is, you know, killing off his stepdaughters just for a pittance, really. But or if you think of the time Doyle was writing these, Jack Stapleton,
yes,
in The Hound, who's you know, everything is focused on his own gain, and you know, this idea, like you say, the community, and Doyle makes ironic points about this with Stapleton throughout The Hound, with the small community that they're mixed up in, and the converse, really, I suppose you could say that this is what Holmes stands against.
Yes,
he's very self-contained, very self-centered at times, but he actually uses his powers for the good of the community.
yes,
and his personality is used for positive reasons. He is that flip side of these sort of egotistical villains.
yes. I think the selfishness is about the sort of breakdown of the social contract in Conan Doyle's eyes. Yeah. So let's have a look at the second one of these stories, which was the love affair of George Vincent Parker.
Yeah, this case begins in the early 1860s with a young man called George Victor Townley, whom Conan Doyle renames George Vincent Parker. He was the son of a Manchester commission agent and became engaged to a young lady called Elizabeth Goodwin, whom Conan Doyle renames Mary Groves, whom he had met at a musical soiree. He was of an artistic temperament and his prospects were vague. Thus, unsurprisingly, she later changed her mind and chose another man, a young clergyman, and asked to be released from her engagement to Townley. He begged for one more meeting, which occurred on the 21st of August at Wigwell Grange near Wirksworth, during which he fatally stabbed her. There was no doubt about his guilt, and he was sentenced to hang. Doubts about his sanity, however, led to a commutation of sentence to life imprisonment. But a year after his incarceration at Pentonville, he committed suicide by throwing himself from a prison gantry. Conan Doyle concurs with the conclusion of madness and approves of the commutation of the death sentence. But interestingly, he doesn't mention Townley's later suicide. Now, we don't know whether this is delicacy, or is it delicacy towards surviving members of the family, or are there other reasons? I think you have a theory, Mark.
Yes, I mean, well, one of the things that has been suggested is this idea that Townley's suicide raises the prospect, would the death sentence have been a more humane outcome? There's a real difficulty here in that we know that Conan Doyle is prone to playing fast and loose with the facts when he wants to. And indeed, in some of the cases around Eagletree and Slater, he decides to sort of downplay certain facts as well. And I think this just doesn't quite fit his narrative. It starts to raise more questions. So I think this is why he leaves this one out, really.
I mean, it would certainly fit in with his theory of supporting the insanity diagnosis, but it's an uncomfortable one. It's also the subject itself, even with the Victorians, for all their relative openness about the subject of death. Suicide was a difficult one. And again, do you want to be talking about this in a magazine like The Strand?
Yeah. And I think this is one of the stories that really shows the passage of time, because there are elements of this that make very hard reading for a contemporary audience, I think, in that he talks about crimes of passion being more interesting than crimes of greed, but is also sort of implying that they're a lesser offence. He says the two classes of crime may be punished by the same severity, but we feel that they are not equally sordid, and that none of us is capable of saying how he might act if his affections and his self-respect were suddenly and cruelly outraged. Even when we endorse the verdict, it is still possible to feel some shred of pity for the criminal. His offence has not been the result of a self-interested and cold-blooded plotting, but it has been the consequence, however monstrous and disproportionate, of a cause for which others were responsible, which is quite an astonishing statement in this case, because actually I do think this is a case of cold-blooded plotting.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a very cruel case.
Yeah.
When you look at it, and it's almost, what you've just read there. It's quite shocking.
It is
in a way, because he's almost shifting the blame to her.
Yeah, he is.
Which is just words fail me on this one, because it's just so wrong.
It is. And I was looking also at, he gave a talk about 10 years later on the theme of responsible and irresponsible criminals. The details of that speech don't survive. We don't know what he covered in it. But I do wonder if that was part of his thinking, where he's trying to weigh the merits and sinfulness of different types of crime. I mean, there is something deeper to this, which we'll come back to, which is, of course, insanity. And the personal family connection to it as well. But I don't think he comes out very well in particularly this case, because it is such a horrible concept to sort of shift the blame onto the woman who's decided that she no longer wishes to be engaged to this man. There is one bit of this story that I did particularly like, which is where he quotes directly from the letter that Parker sends to his former fiancée, which is particularly florid. And Conan Doyle sort of dissects this, and he comes up with a really interesting line. He says, as Professor Owen would reconstruct an entire animal out of a single bone, so from this one little letter, the man stands flagrantly revealed, the scraps of French, the self-conscious allusion to his own savoir-faire, the florid assurances which mean nothing. They are all so many strokes in a subtle self-portrait. And I kind of wish there was more of this kind of stuff within the Strange Studies from Life, where Conan Doyle is tapping into the inherent drama and the characterization. But actually, in practice, the people in this story really don't come alive at all. And I think this is a common thing that he struggles with in all of the Strange Studies, actually.
And there's also an element there where you've got him wanting it both ways.
Yeah.
So you've got him almost letting Townley stroke Parker off the hook
Yeah.
at the end. But here, he's condemning this kind of manipulative individual.
Yeah.
There's quite a bit of this in the Strange Studies from Life.
Yes.
He's playing a double game.
Yeah. So let's have a look at the third of these, which Conan Doyle called The Debatable Case of Mrs. Emsley.
Yeah, this one was actually quite a cause célèbre at the time. And it really was one of the talking points of the year, together with the Road Hill House murder of 3-year-old Savile Kent in Wiltshire. And also, at a cultural level, Wilkie Collins' hugely successful sensation novel, The Woman in White.
Yes.
So all these three things were really in the public consciousness at the time. Mrs. Emsley herself was a wealthy slum landlord who lived frugally and often collected her own rents. But she did occasionally also employ rent collectors and handymen to look after her properties. And two of these were Walter Ems and George, or James, Mullins. And these two became the prime suspects in her murder. Mrs. Emsley was last seen alive on Monday evening, the 13th of August. Ems it was who finally alerted her solicitor to Mrs. Emsley's absence on Friday, the 17th of August. And these two, Ems and the solicitor, together with one of Mrs. Emsley's relations and a police constable, entered the property and found her dead inside with her head battered in. The police remained baffled. Little had been taken, and I think there was £48 or so found in the coal cellar untouched. A reward was offered, and that still led nowhere, until on the 8th of September, Mullins approached the police with some startling information. He had apparently been watching Ems and claimed to have seen him hiding something in a shed near his home at a local brickfields. The police eventually found the package with much theatrical help from Mullins, and it contained a few paltry belongings of Mrs. Emsley. The story soon began to unravel, and it became clear that Mullins, who was a disgraced ex-policeman who had served 6 years in Dartmoor for robbery, had actually planted this evidence to frame Ems for murder and also to claim the reward. Ems, however, had a solid alibi, and Mullins didn't. And he was hanged for Mrs. Emsley's murder on the 19th November 1860, before a crowd of between 20,000 to 30,000 spectators. And he protested his innocence until the end. Now, this is it's a complex case. It really is, and there's a lot going on here. And Conan Doyle's conclusion was that Mullins was very likely guilty, but he felt that a Scottish verdict of not proven would have been more appropriate in the case.
Yes, this one is really all about the accused deserving the benefit of the doubt, really. But there are other features of this one. Conan Doyle really doesn't get across the character of Mrs. Emsley. And when you read the contemporary accounts, and indeed this was featured like the Manor Place case in the Annual Register for 1860. It was written up as one of the two celebrated criminal trials of the year. It's interesting that some of the witnesses spoke about how dreadful a person Mrs. Emsley was. And Conan Doyle never really gets to the bottom of what the motivations are for doing this. If it is just money, because there is, there was money left in the house. It put me in mind a bit of Crime and Punishment, actually. Right at the beginning, you have the old woman who is the pawnbroker who is murdered by Raskolnikov. Conan Doyle seems to have no interest in the social conditions. He actually talks about the houses being humble dwellings, which makes them sound more like they're in the Shire or something.
Yes, it's got a sort of charm to it.
Yes, indeed. He doesn't seem to have any real desire to reflect upon the context in which these crimes take place. It is very much about the quality of the evidence.
He doesn't explore the characters involved. You don't get anything about Mullins's background. I think Conan Doyle, it talks about something like dreadful antecedents or some such phrase.
Yes.
But you don't get the fact that he'd been one of the earliest Metropolitan policemen.
No.
And had actually been on a fast track with promotion and become a sergeant very quickly. And was then seconded to Ireland, where he served as a spy essentially.
Mm.
And that went wrong and he had to be pulled out. But after that, where he thought he'd get great praise,
Mm.
he was actually demoted and just put onto the London Railway Police and had this sense of injustice. And in the end, he ended up being involved with pilfering
Mm.
around the railways and the robbery, which got him into Dartmoor for 6 years. So you've got this very interesting background on him, which none of that comes out in this story. You get no sense of who Ems really was, and Ems was really Mrs. Emsley's leading kind of handyman, rent collector,
Mm.
and he actually was on his way, in his own small way, to becoming a slum landlord himself.
Yes.
So there's that comes in, and also the thing that's not mentioned at all is that Mrs. Emsley died intestate. So she
Ah.
had this massive property empire, and then all these relatives start appearing out of the woodwork, and there's no real sense of what this murder was really about, because nothing of value, real value, was taken.
Mm.
It seems in little doubt that he planted this evidence,
Mm. Mm.
but he was looking for the reward. Whether he had a grudge against Ems, whether he thought, oh gosh, he might get an innocent man hanged, I don't know if he even really thought that through.
No.
It's an enormously complex case, and even to this day, we don't know.
No.
We don't know. I mean, there is a full-length study of this come out in the past few years, The Mile End Murder by Sinclair Mackay,
Mm.
who comes up with his own suspect, which I won't say here in case people want to read it, but I don't think he's come up with a very likely suspect.
Mm. So I think, having looked at the three stories as Conan Doyle has told them, and his real lack of interest in the people involved and the social setting, I mean, the conclusion that we must come to is that his primary interest and reason for writing these is that he's making commentary about the process of criminal justice, and one of the things that particularly attracts his attention is insanity, and whether insanity is a defense that can stand up and be used in the system of criminal justice.
Yes, I mean, it's very telling, really, that we've got three stories here, and two of them do hinge on this issue.
Mm.
And he makes quite detailed comments on this. I mean, on the Youngman case, talking of the trial, he says, when it came out at the trial that the family was sodden with lunacy upon both sides, that the wife's mother and the husband's brother were in asylums, and that the husband's father had been in an asylum, it is doubtful whether the case should not have been judged upon medical rather than upon criminal grounds. In these more scientific and more humanitarian days, it is perhaps doubtful whether Youngman would have been hanged, but there was never any doubt as to his fate in 1860. And then when he's talking about the Townley/Parker case,
Mm.
the whole question turned upon his sanity and led to some curious complications which have caused the whole law upon the point to be reformed. His relations were called to show that madness was rampant in the family, and that out of 10 cousins, 5 were insane. His mother appeared in the witness box, contending with dreadful vehemence that her son was mad, and that her own marriage had been objected to on the ground of the madness latent in her blood.
Mm-hmm.
In many ways, it's not surprising, as we discussed earlier, that some of these stories or cases might have caused offence to the surviving relatives.
Yes, indeed, indeed. I mean, Conan Doyle must have had his father in the back of his head when he was writing this as well.
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely. Well, he has a very interesting earlier comment about the Parker character. He loved music and showed a remarkable aptitude for it. He was an excellent linguist and had some taste in painting. In a word, he was a man of artistic temperament, with all the failings of nerve and of character which that
mm,
temperament implies. Surely there's got to be some thinking about his own background there and his own father.
yeah,
And particularly when he makes the earlier comments about Parker, that he came from a family which was in commerce, and then you think of his own father actually being sent from
yes,
London,
quite.
from the bosom of his artistic family. But he would probably have flourished better in London, but would the problems in his character, i.e. his fondness for alcohol and so on, been even worse in London. It's difficult, but I think Doyle's working some of this through with these.
Yes, it does feel like it as well. I mean, he has a quite he does sort of come down on the lines that the insanity defense is something that could be overused, or there was a danger in it being overused. He actually describes the judges summing up as common sense, and the judge opened his summing up by saying that the world was full of eccentric people, and that to grant them all the immunity of madness would be a public danger. So, obviously, sees the fact that insanity is a defense in some cases. Again, like you're saying before, he's trying to have it both ways, isn't he? He's trying to sort of say, well, there's a public danger here as well from saying, well, everybody's mad, and that's why they do these things. I mean, just to give some background, I mean, the insanity defense was in place by the time that all three of these cases, it really came into being around 1843 as a result of the attempted assassination of the Prime Minister, Robert Peel, by Daniel Macnaghten. Macnaghten had walked up to who he thought was Robert Peel and shot him. And it turned out it was actually Edmund Drummond, who was Peel's private secretary. And he was found guilty on the grounds of insanity and lived out his days in Bedlam. And then his final year was actually in Broadmoor, which had just opened. But Queen Victoria was very concerned of the message that this case was sending, because she herself, of course, was the subject of several assassination attempts. And she wrote to the Prime Minister, again, characteristically not amused. And as a result, the House of Lords convened a panel of judges to consider a series of hypothetical cases and came up with what became known as the Macnaghten rule, which basically said that every man is to be presumed to be sane, and that to establish a defence on the ground of insanity, it must be proved clearly that at the time of the committing of the act, the party accused was labouring under such a defect of reason from disease of the mind as not to know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or if he did know it, that he did not know what he was doing was wrong. I mean, there are alternative interpretations of the Macnaghten case, of course. I mean, one of the weird things about it was that he was found with £750 on his possession, and he was a wood turner by trade. Now, how a wood turner would have on him the equivalent of £80,000 today is a bit of a mystery. And in fact, it has been suggested that perhaps he was actually paid to try to assassinate Peel. The idea of insanity comes up again in divorce law reform. His campaigns for divorce law reform, where he argues actually if a woman is married to a man who is insane, then that should be grounds for divorce as well. But also, of course, he then uses it in cases like Roger Casement. Argues that Casement was mad, and again that thing about medical rather than criminal judgment, that sounds very much like his words about Oscar Wilde.
And the Wilde case as well, as he reports it in Memories and Adventures, he reveals the limits of his own sense of humour on this sort of, where Wilde came up to him, "Have you seen my latest play? It's marvellous." And Doyle took this absolutely seriously. I thought the man must be mad. So it's again that sort of interpretation.
I think he is quite alert to the idea that there might be a medical interpretation of this. There might be an alternative interpretation. The criminal justice system is not the place to treat some of these people.
Well, perhaps this might provide some of the key to the appearance of these Storycom articles. In that, from what we have read, we think that Doyle himself instigated them.
Yes.
And maybe he did this. This is a grounds for this. This is a great platform for me to campaign on these issues. And then, as he's going through it, it's just beginning to drag him down, and it must have brought up things to do with his father, who had been in these asylums. So again, is that bringing him down? Is that, I don't want to look
maybe
into this, and that's another reason why he just abandons the project.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the one area that he is absolutely clear on, I think, is his opposition to capital punishment.
Oh yeah, that's the other central theme at the heart of these, the three that we've got. And this becomes particularly clear in the Mrs. Emsley murder, and in the almost the preface to the main discussion of the case. Conan Doyle says this: Lord Tenterden has whittled down the theory of doubt by deciding that a jury is justified in giving its verdict upon such evidence as it would accept to be final in any of the issues of life. But when one looks back and remembers how often one has been very sure and yet has erred in the issues of life, how often what has seemed certain has failed us, and that which appeared impossible has come to pass, we feel that if the criminal law has been conducted upon such principles, it is probably itself the giant murderer of England. Far wiser is the contention that it is better that 99 guilty should escape than that an innocent man should suffer, and that therefore, if it can be claimed that there is 1 chance in 100 in favour of the prisoner, he is entitled to his acquittal. And so it's pretty strong stuff and pretty clear.
Yeah, absolutely.
A ready opposition to the dangers of capital punishment, as has been proved time and time again.
I think it is very much that fear of a miscarriage of justice that is at the heart of Conan Doyle's opposition to capital punishment, certainly at this time. And you get actually probably a more compelling treatment of this in another story by Conan Doyle, the story of B-24, which was one of the Round the Fire stories, and it appeared in 1899, so probably wrote this about 18 months before he wrote The Strange Studies. And the story is really a kind of discourse on the frailties of the criminal justice system, and specifically on false convictions. So the very title of the story, B-24, is a commentary on the peril of the individual, because the convict in the case, this burglar who is accused of being a murderer, it doesn't actually get a name in the entire story, and the case hinges on the fact that when he burgled the house, the lord of the manor was murdered. In fact, he was murdered, we think, by the lady of the manor, and it's a really fascinating story because Conan Doyle poses really searching questions of his readers on matters of criminal behavior and on recidivism. So is the burglary mitigated by the fact that the burglar has tried hard to follow the straight and narrow, for example? Or is the lady of the manor's act justified because her husband's been cruel towards her? And in fact, the whole story is framed as B-24's appeal to the reader, a sort of unseen and unnamed potential advocate. And so Conan Doyle is very much directly addressing the reader in that case, but you never get to the bottom of it. You never get a verdict. I think it's a much more powerful treatment of this case, but it's about, in Conan Doyle's eyes, I think the wickedness of capital punishment for fear that a miscarriage of justice takes place.
There must be punishment, obviously, which in terms of life imprisonment. But there is also this, again, the campaigning side of Conan Doyle, which is possibly also inspired by some of his other reading. One of his favourite authors who you mentioned earlier, Charles Reade, who used his novels for this sort of reason. It's Never Too Late to Mend and Ticket of Leave Man.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. But he also, Reade was a trained barrister, as well as a novelist, and he actually wrote a series for the Daily Telegraph, which was based upon an 1877 murder case in which a wife had apparently been starved to death by her husband and some of his relatives. But there was medical doubt that she might actually have died from tubercular meningitis, and the medical evidence wasn't allowed in court. And Reade seized on this and wrote a series of anti-capital punishment letters under the title "Hang in Haste, Repent at Leisure." And this is very much along the same sort of lines as Doyle is writing. It's once you've made the mistake, it's irrevocable.
Yeah. I should add as a footnote to this as well, Conan Doyle's opposition to capital punishment did continue throughout his life and took a distinctly bizarre turn in the 1920s when it became conflated with spiritualism. And in The Land of Mist, there's the great ghost hunting chapter with Lord John Roxton, and there's a cleric in that, Mason, who refers to evil spirits being released to prey on the living as a result of capital punishment. He says, if they've been cruel, cunning brutes in life, they're cruel and cunning still, with more power to hurt. It is evil monsters of this kind who are let loose by our system of capital punishment, for they die with unused vitality, which may be expended upon revenge. But even, incredibly, in History of Spiritualism, 1926, he actually claims that individuals might commit crimes because they are possessed by evil spirits. And very late in life, in an article called "The Detective of the Future" for a New York newspaper in 1929, he actually said that the higher teachers in the other world do not approve of capital punishment and will not help to bring about the death of the criminal. So, I think he's trying to find, even then, additional reasons, no matter how ludicrous, for why capital punishment is a bad idea. It carries with him right through to his death, actually.
And it's good that you mentioned here the use Doyle made of his fiction on these issues, B-24 and the Land of Mist, for very, very different purposes.
Yes.
Those. But it is one of the problems that's at the heart of the Strange Studies, is this born novelist and short story writer trying to write these stories from life in an essay form.
Yes.
And feeling uncomfortable with it.
Yes.
And you almost get an element of this in the Vincent Parker case. In fiction, we make people say and do what we should conceive them to be likely to say or do. But in fact, they say and do what no one would ever conceive to be likely. And again, this seems to me to be, once more, is this a paradox? Is it a dichotomy? Is it Doyle wanting things both ways almost? Because you've got this idea that real crime is grim and artless and banal. But then, on the other hand, you've got these wild behaviours and wild outbursts that no novelist would dare to put in.
Yes.
So it's this, again, caught in something of a cleft stick.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, and I think the fascination with the criminal psychology, criminal behavior, is something that stayed with him throughout his life. And that's probably best evidenced by his membership of the Crimes Club. So the Crimes Club was essentially a dinner society. It started as a private dinner society with Arthur Lampton, who was a lawyer and himself a criminal justice campaigner, who got together with a few friends, among them H.B. Irving, Henry Irving's son, and Professor John Churton Collins, who was a Shakespeare scholar, but also a sort of literary critic too, and a number of people. Conan Doyle was actually in the sort of second wave of members, who Lampton referred to as neophytes, who took the membership up to 12, and they included people like, I think later it included people like Sir Edward Marshall Hall, who was I think a jurist and actually was a spiritualist too. Sir Bernard Spilsbury, who was the Home Office pathologist, and later people like Hornung and Jerome K. Jerome became members. Hornung is particularly interesting because he wrote a Raffles story called The Criminologists Club in 1905, in which Raffles dines with members of a criminology society and robs the host. It's quite a good story. But the whole dinner club met 4 times a year under Chatham House rules. Adopted the name, I think, Our Society, to avoid the sort of sensationalist connotations in the 1940s, and eventually it admitted women in the 1990s. It's worth singling out here as well a research thesis by Carrie Selina Paris, a PhD thesis that was written in 2016, which I think is probably the best single study of the Crimes Club. And she makes some really fascinating points about the individuals involved in this, their intersection with campaigns and their motivations and reasons for being involved with this kind of society. But one of the things that really struck me was that she talks about how the society came about at a point where there is the emergence of forensics and the impact that that was having on the criminal justice system. And there's almost this sort of tension between that on the one hand and a kind of sensationalist populist coverage of crime in the press. And of course, arguably, Conan Doyle sits right in the middle of that. The Sherlock Holmes stories sit right in the middle as being a representation of both the sort of scientific rationalism of the detective while also being sensationalist detective novels at the same time. But it's an excellent thesis. It covers an awful lot of ground. It has more information in it than anybody else has really uncovered about the club, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And Conan Doyle presented at the Crimes Club several times, mostly on the Adalji case and on the Oscar Slater case, but also that case I mentioned earlier, Responsible and Irresponsible Criminals. He gave a speech on that in 1910. And then in later years, 1919, he gave a talk on the psychic in crime. And that led to a period in the 1920s where he was bringing in more spiritualist topics. Really seems to have created a kind of very difficult relationship with the Crimes Club. And in fact, he did sort of walk off in a huff at one meeting in the late 1920s when one person gave a speech and I think ended with three rather off-color or blue jokes, and it was very much not to his taste at all. But he did actually come back later.
Yeah, it was an interesting group of people, and very specific in the early days. It just this mix of people involved with the legal world, and then journalists and writers. So as well as the people you've mentioned, another member was A.E.W. Mason, who would create the French detective Inspector Hannot, and Fletcher Robinson, as you say, who of course was involved in the instigation of the Hound of the Baskervilles, and one of the other people in this was the journalist and campaigner George R. Sims, who wrote Christmas Day in the Workhouse, and he was also an on-the-ground journalist at the time of the Jack the Ripper murders. And he used to boast, I was mistaken for him once, that kind of anecdote he loved to tell. But again, the Crimes Club, of course, was interested in the Ripper case. And on the 19th of April 1905, they did do a walking tour of the Ripper sites and the East End, which Conan Doyle was involved in. Years before this, Doyle had actually gone to the Black Museum in December 1892 and seen some of the Ripper exhibits there. He was in the company of his E.W. Hornung again, Jerome K. Jerome, and had the contacts, of course, to be able to get close to the Black Museum. Not everybody could get into the Black Museum by any means, and so he was in this group, and as you said, stayed connected to it. So even though he lost interest, apparently, or for whatever reason, with the strange studies, he certainly didn't lose interest in true crime and the investigation of true crime.
Yes, yeah. And of course, that lifelong fascination with true crime is something that feeds into his his greatest literary creation, into the Sherlock Holmes stories.
Yes, you can see, as we've said, just after the strange studies, he writes The Hound of the Baskervilles, and then in 1903 is persuaded to begin writing the series that becomes The Return of Sherlock Holmes. And you can see a couple of connections, perhaps, to the strange studies emerging in these stories. I mean, in the Solitary Cyclist, Holmes is investigating the persecution of the tobacco millionaire John Vincent Harden, which is very close to George Vincent Parker.
Yes, indeed.
And there's also probably written in 1903, published in January 1904, The Norwood Builder. And this is particularly interesting because you think about the Emsley case, you actually have Mullins trying to set up Ems for murder by planting evidence. And this is precisely what happens in The Norwood Builder.
Yes.
Where it's a different case, obviously. John Soldaker's trying to fake his own death and then frame McFarlane
Mm.
for this. But you do have this kind of trying to get a man hanged for a crime he didn't commit, and then just add some extra evidence, plant it.
Yes.
I mean, in this, like with Mullins, really, it's overstepping the mark and over-egging the pudding.
And Oldacre's a jilted lover as well, isn't he?
Yeah, so he's got this kind of connection to Parker in that way. McFarlane's mother years ago has rejected Oldacre, and he's simmered. It hasn't been one of these hot-blooded things. He's simmered for years. His feelings of resentment, and then he works out this supposedly perfect scheme to get his revenge.
Yes, he'd definitely not get away with the insanity defense.
And there's another. It's not a direct connection to these stories because it's earlier in the canon. But there's an interesting quote from Holmes in the Boscombe Valley Mystery. Circumstantial evidence is a very tricky thing, answered Holmes thoughtfully. It may seem to point very straight to one thing, but if you shift your own point of view a little, you may find it pointing in an equally uncompromising manner to something entirely different. And when Doyle is writing of the Emsley case in Strange Studies, he writes this: "It is true that the cumulative force of the evidence against Mullins was very strong, and that investigation proved the man's antecedents to have been of the worst. But still, circumstantial evidence, even when it all points one way and there is nothing to be urged upon the other side, cannot be received with too great caution, for it is nearly always possible to twist it to some other meaning." So again, he's using his views or voicing his own views on the legal system through Holmes.
Yes.
And this does happen quite often.
Yeah, it does. So that's all we've got time for this episode. If you'd like to read the show notes, you can find them at doingsofdoyle.com. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, please consider leaving us a rating or review on your podcaster of choice. Or perhaps becoming a sponsor. You can find out more at the doingsofdoyle.com website or at our Patreon page. So, Paul, what have we got next time?
Next time, we'll be having a chat with Jonathan Cranfield of Liverpool John Moores University, who's edited the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes for the Edinburgh Work series.
Great. So we look forward to speaking to Jonathan next time. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye. And Conan Doyle really remembered this because in December 1903, at the centenary dinner for Madame Tussauds, he recounted the thrill of entering what he called the sacred halls of the Chamber of Commerce. There's often, and it's always...
sorry.
Go on, yeah?
You said Chamber of Commerce.
Did I say Chamber of Commerce?
You did.
The sacred halls of the Chamber of Commerce.
With all its horrors.